Those who have said be patient and wait, we must say that we cannot be patient. We do not want our freedom gradually, but we want to be free now.
John Lewis, civil rights leader and American statesman. He began his lifelong devotion to racial justice and equality as the teenage son of an Alabama sharecropper, inspired by the courageous defiance of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. At just 23 years old, he became one of 6 key leaders who organized the now famous 1963 March on Washington, standing on the front lines with Dr. King himself during peaceful protests, sit-ins, and marches that redefined the civil rights movement in the 1960s. In 1987, John Lewis joined the United States Congress as Georgia's 5th Congressional District Representative, where he continued his tireless fight for justice and equality for all Americans, until his passing in 2020. WITN reporter India Sage Williams recently sat down with longtime Delaware Senator Chris Coons for an intimate look at who John Lewis was as a mentor and a friend.
John was someone who touched my life, but touched the lives of millions. Mm-hmm. And I was so grateful to John Carney, now our governor, mm-hmm. then a congressman, that when I first got elected to the Senate in 2010, he called me and mm-hmm. said, "You've got to go on this congressional civil rights pilgrimage with John Lewis." Mm-hmm. I'd never met John Lewis at the time. Mm-hmm. And I said, "Well, tell me about it. How does that happen? How does that work?" Mm-hmm. There's an organization called Faith in Politics mm-hmm. That does programming within 4 members of the House and Senate, and that does an annual trip to mm-hmm. Alabama, to typically Montgomery, Birmingham, and Selma, mm-hmm. To revisit some of the landmark sites of the American Civil Rights Movement. Well, John persuaded me to go. I met John Lewis on that first trip. I actually sat next to him on the plane on the flight down after getting to talk to him.
How would you describe his character?
John's just a very special human being. I've met 3 people in the course of my life who I would call living saints. Yeah. And by that I mean you feel different about the world, about yourself, about our history, about our country after even an hour with him. Yeah. John was fierce, relentless, focused on civil rights, on justice, on calling out things that are wrong in our world and then doing something about it.
Sure.
John was funny, warm, humble, casual, yeah. easy to be with. And my first time sitting with him, talking to him, I mean, his legacy mm-hmm. Was so overwhelming that I wasn't, I sort of asked him a couple of questions. What was it like to be the youngest speaker at the March on Washington?
Right. What did he say?
Oh, it was great.
Casually.
He's answered that question, 10,000 times.
Right.
So he walked through it. I mean, he was patient with me. He sort of gave me, sort of along about the speech and the moment and the pressure he was under to make it a little less forceful and, how anxious he was, but how confident he was and how the event came together. Mm-hmm. But after we'd spent half an hour in which I'd asked him a series of the questions you would ask interviewing a great man,
sure.
he turned to me and he said, it's okay to just talk about baseball.
Life.
Except I don't really care much for baseball. But he was so easy to be with mm-hmm. and so generous of spirit. And walking through, an airport together or, going to get a burger together or just kind of being together, I saw him over and over and over take the time to be just gracious and humble and funny.
Yes.
We ultimately traveled together 5 times and to a bunch of different places. That same pilgrimage, one year they added Memphis. And we went to the Lorraine Motel and to the museum that's now there and to the place where King preached his last sermon and looked at the history of the I Am a Man, the sanitation worker strike, met one of the sanitation workers who was there. And one year we went to Tuscaloosa and heard from Governor Wallace's granddaughter, Peggy, about what it was like to be daughter Peggy, and heard from her what it was like to be a little girl as her dad was literally standing in the schoolhouse door refusing to allow integration, and then federal marshals had to come. And she sat in the middle of the gym side by side with one of the very first students to integrate the University of Alabama, and they had a conversation. Another trip we took was to South Carolina, which was right after the Emanuel AME, the shooting at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, where Dylan Roof, a white racist, came and killed 9 people. And we spent time with 2 of the survivors, and went to Orangeburg, went to Columbia, went to Charleston. And there's all sorts of rich and complex history of the civil rights movement from South Carolina that I just didn't know. And then not long after that, John and I and a group from Congress and those 2 survivors from Charleston and Bobby Kennedy's daughter went to South Africa to meet with some of the surviving heroes of the liberation struggle and to talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, how South Africa, a majority black country, is working through the consequences of its history of apartheid. And then just this spring, I went on my last pilgrimage with John to Alabama. His voice was still strong, his spirit was still uplifting, but you could see his pancreatic cancer was having a really heavy impact on him. He still marched us across the bridge. He still stopped and stood up and spoke, but he had to be steadied by Michael Collins, his dear friend and supporter. And I think all of us had this heavy moment as we knew that would be the last time we'd be with him.
Wow. So he felt that. Standing
next to him on the bridge was James Lawson, a professor from Nashville, who really was he trained and instructed a lot of the college students in nonviolence.
Yes.
And he hadn't been to that pilgrimage, back to that bridge, at that place with John in a long time.
Sure.
And I was 10 feet away as the 2 of them embraced and stood and spoke for 20 minutes. And you could see 2 brothers in the struggle who knew they would next see each other on the other side.
Right.
It was so powerful.
Super powerful. Talk to me about some important moments that you had where you learned key lessons, and what were those lessons that you learned from him?
John, Congressman Lewis, was relentless. He was energetic. He didn't ever sort of sit back and, sort of say, okay, well, I did great things, 50, 60, 70 years ago.
Right.
He staged a sit-in on the floor of the House of Representatives. Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester can give you far better chapter and verse on his work, continuing to press for the restoration of the Civil Rights Act, which was the work product of Bloody Sunday and of that march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. But in confronting gun violence, in his deep frustration that this bill that we passed in the Senate wasn't going to get taken up in the House, he said, we ought to just do a sit-in. So they did. They just sat down, shut down the work of the House, and occupied the floor. I came over and joined in that, along with dozens and dozens of House members. He never lost a spirit of insistence, and he was active in dozens of issues over the decades that he was serving in the House of Representatives. He also, there was a young man, Tyree, I think is his name, Tyree perhaps, Law, who lived about 7 hours away from Birmingham, who heard, I think on the news, that John was going to be there. This was 2 years ago on the pilgrimage. And his grandmother drove him the whole way, young, like 10 or 11 years old. And he stood outside the church where we were having a worship service with a little sign that he'd handmade saying, my name is Tyree Faw. I've come all the way from, I think it was Nashville, just to meet you.
Right.
John comes walking out, and he has there's dozens of members of the House and Senate and press and other folks
The whole
engaged in this,
shebang,
right?
yeah, yeah.
And he sees and he stops and he sort of pulls the young man aside and sits and talks with him for. He and I were exchanging notes on Facebook this weekend, and he said to him, "Oh, this is wonderful. This is great. You've done it. You know, come join us."
Yes, be a
And
part.
so he came back this year. He was with us the entire pilgrimage. He came up to Washington and spent time with John. John never lost a youthful spirit, an enthusiasm for young people and for the ways in which they can be wonderfully challenging.
Because he was a young man. When
He was the
right?
youngest leader.
And fiery spirit.
Absolutely. When we were in South Africa at the University of Cape Town, we had a very challenging moment. So this is the 50th anniversary of Bobby Kennedy's Ripples of Hope speech, which is a famous speech in South Africa where a white American is coming to call out apartheid and to say in the United States, we are moving towards change. You too in South Africa should do the same thing, basically. And John Lewis is speaking. And I hear this noise. And then everybody hears this noise and we all turn around and there's sirens and right? A group of student protesters came in and interrupted the remarks by John Lewis and Bobby Kennedy's daughter. And I was simultaneously really upset.
They came to protest.
They interrupted the speech. They
Wow.
took over the space.
Wow.
They stopped the proceedings. They stood up there with, signs and part of me was really offended. You are disrespecting this remarkable, significant, right? Nelson Mandela's widow, who was the chancellor of the university, was also presiding over the proceedings, right? But John also was the one who was like, hang on a minute.
Right.
They're doing what I did.
Right.
Let's just take a few minutes and sit down and listen to them. And he redirected the whole thing in a positive direction. So John never lost both an openness to challenge, a spirit of optimism and activism, and an enthusiasm for life.
Yeah.
The last thing he did as a public act was to go out in the middle of a main thoroughfare in Washington, D.C. with the mayor, where she had painted Black Lives Matter. Right? This is just 2 blocks from the White House.
Yes, yes, yes. I remember that moment when it happened and it was just going wild on social media. No one could believe it. And it was real.
I mean, that was just days before he passed.
Yeah.
But for him, I think I can say this, he took just enormous encouragement from seeing tens of millions of Americans in cities and towns, large and small, all over the country, after the brutal murder of George Floyd, saying, this is a moment, this is an awakening, this is an engagement in which we have to make change. We have to finish the work that John was such a critical conductor on that journey that is far from finished and far from over.
And he was fighting until the end of
Absolute
his life.
last few days.
You know, what is disheartening for me as a Black woman, seeing what is happening in this country right now, that is no different than what was happening 50, 60 years ago. Sure, of course things have progressed and things have changed. However, we are still having this conversation about racism. We are still having this conversation about inequality. We are still having this conversation about police brutality. I was watching the presser last night of Jacob Blake's family, and his lawyer, Benjamin Crump, says, how many more examples do we need of police brutality for things to change? When is enough going to be enough?
Benjamin Crump was actually the keynote speaker at this year's NAACP convention in Delaware. He has represented family after family and is a forceful advocate for change. The other thing that was said last night at that same presser was his mother said, please do not take over this moment and don't disrespect his memory. Peaceful protest. Do not set all of downtown Kenosha on fire because that then produces this backlash against criminality. A core issue for John Lewis's witness was that he was committed to peaceful protest. What that meant was he was risking his own physical safety and security. I am in awe at his discipline that James Lawson helped train and teach him in, but that so many others showed in the sit-ins, the lunch counter sit-ins in Nashville, in the freedom rides across the South that resulted in the integration of bus transportation, and then ultimately in that bridge, the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. But to your point, we should not today, 50 plus years later, be seeing an incident after incident, deadly violence against black and brown citizens.
Do you think that peaceful protests will be enough? Will be enough to solve this issue that we're seeing?
Yes, and I think escalating to violence that sets things on fire and destroys property, while understandable as an expression of anger, won't be successful.
What advice would you give to protesters today?
To not give up, to not stop speaking up and speaking out, to hold accountable your elected officials, to present specific programs and actions, and to not stop being engaged. But to understand that there is legislation in the Congress of the United States that has passed the House and that is waiting action in the Senate, because the majority leader of the Senate will not take it up and will not give it a vote. Unless the control of the Senate of the United States changes, unless who's the president changes, that legislation isn't going anywhere. So in 1922, the House of Representatives passed an anti-lynching bill that went nowhere in the Senate of the time. We have passed bills in the Senate when it was controlled by Democrats that then went nowhere in the House when it was controlled by Republicans. You have to keep pressing and pushing. At the time in 1965 that the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge happened, the thing that turned that into law was having as the President of the United States Lyndon Baines Johnson, who had grown up in the South, who understood the racial history and the division and the urgency, and that only access to the ballot box was going to end legal segregation in the South and in the country. We're at a similar moment where we have the possibility of a president who understands this history, who is from Delaware, and who sees the work that is yet to be done, and who has a running mate who is the lead co-author of that sweeping change bill in the Senate that is not getting a vote today.
What do you think is going to happen in this country if voter oppression becomes a reality?
Well, voter suppression is a reality. We've had case after case. There was a recent case in North Carolina where a federal judge reversed the maps that were drawn by the North Carolina General Assembly, saying that they had targeted black voters with surgical precision and drawn lines to prevent actual meaningful representation. So gerrymandering, the misapplication of redrawing congressional district lines is alive and well. And after a Supreme Court decision called Shelby County versus Holder, one of the key provisions of the Voting Rights Act that John played such a central role in passing got taken away. That's why there's a bill called the John Lewis Voting Rights Restoration Act that I'm a co-sponsor of. That I had a copy of that bill.
Talk to me about that moment.
So this was the 50th anniversary of the march across the bridge. President Bush spoke and President Obama spoke, and there were dozens and dozens of members of the House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans. And we had the first version of this bill at that point 5 years ago to restore so-called pre-clearance, which means you can't make changes to polling places and to voting practices and to hours and to days. If you're a city, county, or state that has been found in violation of the Voting Rights Act, for 5 years after that, you cannot change anything without sending it to the Department of Justice and having them pre-clear it. Because you've demonstrated as a community, as a state, that you are trying to suppress the vote. So I have a copy of that bill in my pocket. As we're marching across the bridge, everybody's singing, and we've gone to Brown Chapel AME, and everyone's in good spirits. And I'm pulling a copy of this bill. I had several copies. I'm handing them to my Republican colleagues saying, take this. co-sponsor it with me.
Right.
This is why we're marching across this bridge.
Right.
It isn't just history.
Right.
It is a present problem that if you're not willing to put your name on it, why are you here? Several of them got very upset with me.
What makes you so passionate about this work?
A life lived in Delaware, informed by experiences in other places in our country and the world. As a young man, I spent time in Kenya at the University of Nairobi as an exchange student, and the students who were there with me at the time just were relentless, were kind and welcoming, with wonderful hospitality.
I love Kenyan people.
But very forceful and very clear. At the time, the apartheid regime in South Africa had the support of the Reagan administration in Washington. And they just could not accept or understand how the United States was on the wrong side of history. And Reagan explained it in terms of Marxism. He said, oh, the ANC is a Marxist organization. I then spent a year studying, researching, looking at South Africa and the similarities between legal segregation in Delaware and the United States and in South Africa. I read a book called White Supremacy that was powerful, that analyzed the similarities between the United States and South Africa. And then I went to South Africa and spent 3 months there working for Desmond Tutu in the South African Council of Churches. And it revealed to me whole chapters of Delaware's history that I didn't know, and of our world history that I didn't know. I grew up in Hockessin.
Right.
We just had a ceremony 2 weeks ago where a little brick school, so-called College School Number 7, was a centerpiece of a Supreme Court case that even though I grew up, I mean, not even a quarter mile away, I had no idea when I was a kid. I had no idea of that history.
Right.
That's actually a positive piece of Delaware's history, in that Brown versus Board of Education, which was a landmark Supreme Court civil rights case, was actually 5 cases pulled into one. The Delaware case was the one where Delaware got it right and ordered the integration of our schools, ordered the integration of Claymont High School, of that school in Hockessin, and of the University of Delaware in a series of 3 decisions. There's lots of other aspects of Delaware's history that is dead wrong.
Right.
One of the things most Delawareans don't know is that Juneteenth may have been the day that slaves in Texas, in Galveston,
Heard about it.
heard about the
But not
Emancipation
everyone.
Proclamation. But in Delaware, slavery did not end until the last day of that year. And Delaware was one of the last states to ratify the amendment to the Constitution that made slavery illegal.
So it's at this point in your life where your eyes are now opening up
I'm
to the
looking
truth.
around going, I can't believe I did not know all this, and I can't believe I lived a life without engaging and being active and being purposeful on it. I also was blessed to have a friend who also grew up here, Crystal Nix Hines, whose father, Theophilus Nix, was one of the first black lawyers in Delaware history and had been a litigator. And she starts talking to me all the time. And what are you going to do about this?
Right.
I was 23 years old, I think, at the time. So, and it led me to do quite a few things.
And that's why you are so bold, even in that moment of taking out that piece of paper out of your jacket pocket and saying, here, this is what we need to do to make a change.
John Lewis sat me down over breakfast that morning and said, what are you doing?
Right.
What are you going to do about this?
Right.
And so when a man like that asks you a question, you better have an answer. The other thing I did, and it's unrelated, but it's directly related. We were at that point in the middle of immigration reform. And before I went on that trip, my chief counsel of the time had come to me and said, here's a whole series of proposed amendments to this bill. Nobody on the committee is willing to carry them because they improve the legal standing, or they advocate for the rights of illegal immigrants in detention facing deportation. There's literally nobody willing to take up their cause because there's all these other things that the committee is looking at. And he said, but these are people who deserve their moment, their chance in court, their opportunity to make their case. And it was after talking to John that I went, That's not politically popular. In fact, that is literally the most politically unpopular thing I could do right now.
Right.
So we ultimately succeeded in getting one Republican. It was Senator Murkowski of Alaska to agree to join the bill. But I also introduced those amendments and chaired a hearing on those relevant issues. This was 5 years before a president of the United States separated parents from their children at the border.
Yeah.
But it was that same issue.
Yeah.
It was when someone comes across the border illegally, are they entitled to anything? Are they entitled to any representation, to any advocacy, to any, or can you simply do to them whatever you wish because they're not citizens?
Right.
It was that issue 5 years earlier.
Wow.
And it was frankly, simply because I knew we were not doing right as a country. John Lewis believed in America before America believed in him.
Sure.
He lay in state in the rotunda of the United States Capitol. His casket lay on the same stand, the catafalque, that Abraham Lincoln's casket lay on. There was just layer upon layer of meaning in those moments. In a building, the Capitol of the United States, which was largely built by slaves, but in which Lincoln was an advocate for abolition as a member of the House, and in which John Lewis, right, a century and a half later, was the legislator who helped push and push and push to make that Emancipation Proclamation mean something.
Right.
And I got to see Joe and Jill Biden in the rotunda as they came to pay their last respects to John. And it was Karen Bass who, I mean, this just was all coincidental that we all ran into each other at the same place at the same time. Nothing is a coincidence. Karen Bass, who is the chair of the Africa Subcommittee in the House and was an anti-apartheid activist in Los Angeles and represents the district where the Watts riots happened and is now leading as the head of the Congressional Black Caucus the legislative efforts that are coming to the Senate and not moving. That just happened a few weeks ago.
Right.
It was John Lewis's life that has challenged so many of us, but his was just one more life of purpose in what is a very long journey towards justice.
I read a quote somewhere that said, you know, it's very important for us to honor his life and those that, you know, contributed to the civil rights movement with our words, but it's even more important to contribute with deeds. Do you feel like right now it may be a slap in the face or disrespect to the work that they did to see how the lives that he fought for, Black lives, the respective Black lives, are still not being taken serious, are still not being protected? We have Breonna Taylor, we have George Floyd, now Jacob Blake. There's so many others that I could name. Is it a slap in the face to his legacy?
So, yes is the short answer. The longer answer is, and I'm trying to figure out how to say this in a way that conveys, we are being asked, if you watch the Democratic convention and the Republican convention, it suggests that we can't have a police, you have a choice. You either have to completely support the police and policing and civil order and accept that with some regularity there's going to be horrible incidents where men are shot in the back as they're walking away, or where people die in police custody, or where people are strangled or suffocated to death while being arrested. You just have to accept that. Or, this was the stark difference that was painted in what I was seeing in the convention, or Democrats somehow accept, you know, complete like violence and lawlessness and right. There is a middle ground that makes perfect sense, which is what I think we all want and deserve. A safe community in which all lives are respected and Black lives matter, because our police, who have our support and respect and admiration, conduct themselves constitutionally. I mean, it's not a choice between chaos and violence and people dying in custody who are Black and brown. We ought to be able to have a society where the laws work and where rule of law matters and where protests are peaceful and police are law-abiding. And it's just, it should not be this divisive an issue or this hard to achieve.
Where do you think the disconnect is coming from? We agree on this. We're on the same page. What's happening with
Well,
the rest
and
of America?
what's striking, I've talked to a lot of folks I've known a long time over the last few days. Some critics feel like the Democratic convention didn't do enough to denounce violence and protests, and that somehow Joe Biden believes in defunding the police, which he doesn't.
Right.
And then on the other side, you know, Democrats feel like there is not enough clarity about this moment, that there isn't enough clarity that the reason we need to say Black Lives Matter is because life after life after life is snuffed out under circumstances. Ahmaud Arbery was going for a jog, right? I mean, if a young man who is just a little quirky and is into music and is listening, right, and ends up dead in Aurora, Colorado, because the police overreact and overrespond and read this situation wrong, and then there seems to be no accountability and no consequences, then we have to say Black Lives Matter, because the actions, the consequences of these incidents over and over and over, year in and year out, raise the question, is this a society in which Black lives don't matter? So I had a very sharp exchange with a friend the other night. He was watching basketball. This is a white friend of mine, former neighbor, who says to me, why does the basketball court have to say that? Why has it got to be on all the... And I said, well, I miss what? He said, why? I just want to watch a game. I said, is it not clear to you? I said, did you hear what LeBron James had to say the other day? Right? Is it not clear to you that this is a pressing, urgent moment?
Issue.
And let me frame it this way before we have to conclude. I made some remarks at the Democratic National Convention by way of introducing my friend and predecessor in the Senate, Joe Biden, now the nominee to be our next president. I was talking about Joe's faith. And in particular, I purposefully said, Joe sees clearly that racism is the founding sin of this nation, that slavery and white supremacy, which have cast a shadow so deep and so long that it impacts our society in so many ways structurally today. That is a faith issue in this election. And it is a challenge for people of faith to look at it clearly and now say, what are we going to do? John Lewis was someone who, as a young man in Troy, Alabama, went to the library and got told, you can't borrow a book.
Yeah, you can't come in.
And his life was animated by this sense of, if you see something wrong, act like it and do something. His family said, don't cause trouble. Don't stir things up. Don't get in the way.
Leave it alone.
And he spent the rest of his life getting in good trouble and getting in the way.
What's some good trouble that you've gotten into in your line of work?
Well, there's small, medium, and large. You know, the small, but I think significant, is, and this is not trouble, this is just doing the work. Making sure that the folks who work with me, I have about 50 staff in total between Dover and Wilmington and Washington. If you look at the diversity of the folks who work with me, it has improved year after year after year for 5 years. That was the result of an activist here in Delaware challenging me directly on that and saying, are you measuring it? Are you making progress? Are you making changes? Does your team look like Delaware?
Right.
That's not getting in trouble, that's making change. Getting in trouble is moments when, either in protests, which I used to engage in much more as a young man than today, or on the floor of the Senate, or marching across that bridge, I'm pushing and challenging and questioning and testing. More often than not, what I'm doing is saying to a Republican colleague, here's a bill that right now has not one Republican on it. It's all Democrats. And so that means it's going nowhere. Right? It's a prophetic bill that has no pragmatic path towards enactment. Medium size. I've got a bill called Driving for Opportunity. We've got a whole bunch of Democrats on it. We had the NAACP supported, and the ACLU, and the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. But after a lot of work, my lead co-sponsor is now Roger Wicker, a Republican from Mississippi. And he's brought along a dozen Republicans. We managed to get the Koch brothers network, Evangelicals for Action, a whole series of conservative groups and police groups are now advocating for it. It would reverse what is a long-standing federal policy that's part of the war on drugs. of saying if you have unpaid criminal fines, you lose your license. Even if it's unrelated to driving safety, right? That's impacted 11 million Americans.
Yeah. And
it causes police to be involved in traffic stops that are unnecessary other than you have a suspended license. It has nothing to do with traffic safety. It has nothing to do with active law enforcement. They have to pull you over because as they run your plate, it says you have a suspended license. So this promotes public safety. Frankly, taking someone's license away often means they're now going to lose their job. You got to choose between losing your job or risking being rearrested because you're driving without a license, right? So this is something that dozens of states have done, but federally we haven't reversed it.
Sure.
That's, in my view, a concrete product. And then last is working alongside Cory Booker and Kamala Harris, colleagues of mine, senators on the Judiciary Committee, in advocating for and in advancing comprehensive reform that meets this moment, that will be difficult to get past, that has caused some real distance and difficulty with some long-standing friendships, but I think we'll get there. I think we'll get that done.
What are some issues in Delaware right now that you want to get on top of?
There's more than we have time for me to talk about, but let me just say we're in the middle of a healthcare pandemic where its impact nationally as well as locally reveals the ways in which access to healthcare, health equity, access to housing, to opportunity is unequal. That's also the consequence of the recession that we're in the middle of. This recession is deeper and it's going to be longer because of a bungled federal response by the administration to testing, to PPE, to contact tracing, to getting us back up. I feel strongly that when Joe Biden says, I want to build back better, what he's really saying is, I see the ways in which our healthcare system and our economy are unequal, and so the impacts of all this have been felt unequally. And I don't just want to take us back to where we were a year ago. I want to build us in a way that makes us stronger and better. And I have a dozen bills around access to credit, access to skills training, access to education and higher education opportunity, and improvements in the healthcare system around prescription drugs that would strengthen our society. I could go on.
To close us out, let's start with, what is the legacy that you're going to leave behind? John Lewis was very big on legacy. He was very big on leaving your mark. Like you said, he was very big on doing something about what you felt was unjust, wrong, whatever. Do something, right? And so what is your legacy that you're planning to leave behind when you're no longer here?
I'm not quite thinking about when I'm no longer here.
No.
but you never know the day, and you don't know the hour.
Yeah.
One of my favorite engagements with John Lewis ever was the day that he came to Delaware. And we spent a day where we went to an elementary school, and he's got a graphic novel, March. That's a fancy word for a great comic book. And he gave out copies to the elementary school students, and then he answered their questions. And he just had such a heart. We had a wonderful event at this elementary school. Then at Theater N, he did a roundtable with about 50 young community leaders, folks who are hopeful, who are engaged, but and he had a powerful message of encouragement, but then also did a great Q&A with them. Then we did a town hall with several hundred people from all over Delaware. John, in that one day, touched very young people, touched activists who are engaged and who are hungry for their opportunity, for their moment to lead, and then connected and spoke to and engaged the whole scope of our community. That one day was a purposeful and positive day that started conversations that have led to a whole series of initiatives. If I could have one day as significant as that day, I would have left a legacy that I'd be proud of. One of the things I am starting conversations around is the absence of a genuine look at our history that then sustains and propels us forward. In Delaware, we don't really have the engagement, the curriculum, the resources that teaches young Delawareans about our history. If I grew up in Hockessin and didn't know about that school that was a quarter mile from where I grew up, and its history and its place in our national civil rights history, there's probably more work to be done. Governor Carney is leading a lot of that work, but I'm looking forward to partnering with him and other educators and other leaders in making progress on that. If the generation that is currently coming up in our elementary schools gets a better, clearer, stronger education about all the history of Delaware, then we're more likely to confront and resolve some of the pieces of our history. Second, Brian Stevenson runs the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama. He's a Delawarean. He's come and spoken here a number of times. He was the keynote speaker at that pilgrimage that we just did earlier this year that John was also a key part of. He's challenged every state in which there was a lynching to own it, to memorialize it, and State Senator Darius Brown and one of Brian's nieces, Samantha, and a whole group of community leaders have twice now erected a marker, an historical marker, at the location where there was one thoroughly documented public lynching in the history of the state of Delaware. There were likely others. A community conversation around reclaiming and recovering that history, confronting it, and then looking at the things we have to change to ensure that similar incidents are not happening today. I would say is another secondary piece. To me, that feeds into the possibility of a national conversation that then leads to the legislation, the investment, and the change for which we are all not just hoping, but working.
Thank you so much, Senator Coons.
Thank you, India.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Goodbye.